Hello everybody and welcome to Emsi webinars. Very excited today. We've got a great webinar in store for us. We have 5 great panelists, which will be introduced in a minute by Matt, our presenter, who is the Director of Workforce Intelligence at Emsi UK. The webinar today, as you know, is on the state of the nation. What is the state of the nation, basically, especially with the impact of COVID-19? If you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please put them in the questions box on your control panel, and we will endeavour to get back to you and answer your questions. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Matt. Hi, Matt.
Good morning, Debbie. Thank you very much for the intro, and good morning to everybody who's joining us today. Great to be here, and as Debbie said, an action-packed agenda, so I hope you find it useful and informative. First of all, apologies if people feel slightly depressed by the image they're seeing on this slide. That was actually inspired by my watching of the Umbrella Academy, as opposed to feeling negative about what's going on in the world, although of course it's challenging times. Just a bit about today's agenda. So quick introduction to Emsi, and then I'll make introductions to the panelists that we're joined by. Then we're going to run through a couple of different sections actually on what's going on in the labour market. So first of all, the first half, we're going to look at unemployment, redundancies and furlough data, and give you a bit of insight as to a number of data sets that we're seeing and analysing there. And then we'll get some perspectives from our panellists on what they're seeing in different parts of the economy. Then the second half of the presentation, we'll move on to look at hiring activity, vacancies, recruitment activity, and some workforce trends that we're also seeing across the nation. And again, get some perspectives from our panelists on those and what they're seeing in their worlds. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some thoughts on the risks and opportunities for next year. And then obviously, as Debbie said, we'll hopefully have time to answer any questions that you've raised as the audience. So hope that sounds okay, and look forward to cracking on. A bit about Emsi. For those of you that don't know us, we're a labour market intelligence business. We glean data from a range of sources, government sources and big data sources. And we use that to help organisations make better decisions about their workforce and about their activities. We work across an array of sectors, and that includes the education sector, the economic development and government world, and in the corporate markets and consultancy world. And what I'm really excited about today actually is, with more than 500 people joining us on the webinar, is that we've really got a healthy mix of people from all those parts of the economy. And we really believe that there's an opportunity to work together across those different groups to hopefully navigate our way out of what are clearly challenging times. The panelists, so I'm just going to say hi to everyone. Toni joins us from the Impellam group, who are one of the UK's largest recruitment businesses with multiple brands that many of you will know. So good morning, Toni. Thanks for joining.
Good morning. Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Great. No, great to have you here. Phill joins us really from a sports and leisure background and leads business transformation in Cimspa, who are the Chartered Institute for the Management of Sports and Physical Activity. So has both a sort of a sector lens and also a professional body lens in terms of setting sector standards. So good morning, Phill. Very welcome.
Good morning, Matt, and thank you for inviting us on.
Pleasure. Then we've got Ali, who joins us from the commercial real estate firm Jones Lang LaSalle, so one of the UK's largest firms that looks at real estate portfolio across the nation. So good morning, Ali, and welcome again.
Morning, Matt. Thanks very much.
And finally, last but not least, is the brains behind Emsi, our chief economist, Duncan Brown. So good morning, Duncan.
Hi, Matt. I think my expectations have been raised. But thank you.
We like to do that, Duncan, you know, set the platform. We're going to start, Duncan and I are going to have a chat initially about what's going on with unemployment data. And I guess, you know, we've all read the headlines, we've all seen, you know, kind of what the government are announcing on this, you know, with a significant rise over certainly the last month's release, and you know, since March up to 121% rise in unemployment levels. significant changes in PAYE levels, and also, I guess, some slightly worrying trends around youth unemployment. But Duncan, so from your sort of economist perspective, what do you see is going on at the moment, and where are we with using unemployment data as an indicator of sort of the workforce and economy?
Yeah, so I think in some ways, the first thing we should note is that in the short term, the government's furlough intervention has worked. If you look at that rise in the survey-based unemployment rate there, 3.9 to 4.1%, that's a very small increase. Obviously bad for the people concerned, but in the US, for example, which didn't have a furlough scheme, they saw the unemployment rate absolutely rocket, sort of go into the high teens, I believe, at one point, and has since come down. And so it certainly seems as though furlough has had its effect. And I mean, the claimant count, which is the second line there, has gone up a lot, but that's been really kind of polluted by a few different factors. One is that it now covers universal credit, which means that you might not be fully unemployed, but still claiming it. Second of all, there is some sense that some people immediately went to claim for benefits and then found out they were furloughed rather than losing their job. And so there may be some kind of double counting effectively there. So overall, I mean, the survey-based unemployment is the more reliable one. And we also have it from jobs data from companies now. So we have the Q2 workforce jobs data, and that shows jobs have moved down by about 1% overall, which is not a huge change, especially when you put it in the context of the GDP data that came out yesterday, which confirmed that Q2 was down around 20%, which is astonishing in itself. And so this is furlough in action, that basically it kept people in jobs even though they weren't doing any work. And we know that furloughs kind of affected sort of 25-30% of employees at some point or other. So yeah, it's kind of an odd situation where the labour market is kind of, the affected part of the labour market is slightly been frozen, as was the design of furlough, but the question will be what happens when that ends.
And so we're kind of, I guess, reaching the end of that sort of period of almost waiting, aren't we? So Q4 is going to be critical in your view in terms of the numbers?
Absolutely. So the full furlough scheme, the coronavirus job retention scheme, ends this month, October, and so that's kind of tearing off the plaster and seeing what's underneath. And that's going to be a big change, as I think we'll come on to. There's a new scheme that's been announced to sort of follow on from it, which is a bit milder in its support. And so I think the government are worried that because there are some lockdown restrictions creeping back in, that their hope that the economy would kind of be able to start back on the mend fully has been put back a bit. So
I'm going to, in fact, it's something I'm going to probably ask our panelists about a bit later, is obviously the job support scheme, because that's obviously new and people are still digesting the detail of that. Just, I mean, still on sort of unemployment levels, one of the things that we've looked at is kind of the geographical impact of that. And I've also put some data up there that looks at employment levels and the impact on different age groups. But just from a regional perspective, Duncan, are you seeing anything in the data that kind of suggests there are more worrying trends in different parts of the country than others?
I think on some level that there's a slightly obvious trend, which is that places which have more concentrations of consumer-facing services, so hotels, restaurants, high street retail, are all going to be more affected. So London is an obvious standout place there, especially the centre of London. And there's an additional dimension in London because a lot of the trade there for those industries, even as they've reopened, is quieter because, of course, people aren't commuting into the centre of London anymore. So a lot of the kind of the footfall that they would get is has disappeared because people who can are working from home more. Tourist areas obviously have had a terrible summer, and of course a lot of those are coastal communities that haven't got a lot of other economic advantages, and so yeah, those are the ones that stand out. I mean, I think certainly since sort of June, July time, other industries have to greater or lesser extent been able to move back to some degree of normalcy. The sort of the big questions are over those consumer facing services and then those that serve them directly.
Yeah. And it's interesting looking, isn't it, at the age data of the workforce in terms of employment levels and where those are dropped, because that might as well give an indication as to the type of jobs and the type of skill levels that this is affecting.
I mean, if you think about young people, as you can see there, the survey data suggests that their employment's fallen a lot. Well, of course, all those kind of retail, restaurant jobs are exactly the kind of entry-level jobs that a lot of young people, especially sort of students and so on, can often find their way into very easily. And so their sort of drying up is a real kind of problem, and will present issues for some time, I think.
Yeah, no, interesting. I mean, one of the other things that we did, and this was a bit of a manual curation process, in addition to looking at government data sets, is we looked at, let's look at all of the public announcements that have been made from some of the UK's largest companies and the redundancies that they're intending to make, having been through a consultation process. And totaling that up across the media, and this is by no means a complete data set, but I got to just under 200,000 or so redundancies that we know are coming. And just looking at that by sector, it's quite interesting, isn't it, to kind of align that to the furlough programme and to what we're seeing from an unemployment perspective. I think perhaps banking and financial services being a bit of an outlier, but certainly food and beverage, retail, and other sectors, travel, that stand out as being, you know, kind of most at risk. Now, this is obviously the bigger companies that will sort of disclose this data. But Duncan, I mean, any perspectives on this in terms of forecast trend, or is it too early to say?
It's too early to say. I mean, I think that the end of furlough will probably cause a surge in redundancy announcements in the next few months, sad to say. I think that actually, if you look at the total redundancy data that the ONS records and publishes, it hasn't gone up by that much, which is a reflection of what we were talking about earlier about unemployment not really going up that much. But of course, if in July you thought you'd need to make redundancies, well, you could just put everybody on furlough and give them more time and give you more time to work out what to do. But of course, when that ends, depending on what effect the job support scheme has, that will, we may well see the sort of the redundancies coming up to the level that we were previously expecting. I mean, hopefully furlough has sort of a persistent effect, and some of them have not just been delayed but forestalled entirely, but we'll have to see. One thing I would say is that there are always redundancies going on, even in the best of times in the economy, and so there are always companies that just meet their natural end. There are always sectors that are changing in some way. I mean, obviously, you know, banking is a sector that's seen a lot of changes in recent years, is affected by Brexit and so on. So, you know, there are other factors in the background there. Aviation, though, is an interesting one because of what's happened to international travel. I mean, it's kind of an unavoidable fact of life that from 2019 to 2020, the air travel industry has seen its worst change in its history, I imagine.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I mean, I've just flashed up a couple of the, you know, this is kind of the scale and the brands that make up that data in terms of the kind of announcements. And I guess, as you say, it really depends on, you know, there's multiple variables, aren't there? Kind of lockdown 2.0, whatever that ends up evolving as, and obviously the job support scheme. So, yeah, interesting, an interesting time for us. I mean, and I noticed as well in the House of Commons paper this week, that the OBR have put their sort of forecast or their foot in the mix of what they're thinking is likely to happen, but which is, you know, quite worrying. But from your perspective, I mean, any views as to what you think might happen. I know we don't tend to do forecasting, but personal views about what reality might be.
I mean, I think that the main thing I would say is that I mean, economic models don't have the best record of kind of precision in forecasting, as is well discussed. And changes of the magnitude that we have at the moment are, just really put that to the test. And that quote there about the OBR forecast kind of makes the point that, I mean, they're forecasting that the unemployment rate would peak at a level between 9.7 and 13.2%. Well, that's kind of a million people's difference. It's a huge margin of error that they're putting there, and I think that's right. I mean, who knows? And there are such big variables at work. We hear talk that there may be a vaccine next summer, but then again, there might not be. And so, it's very difficult to really kind of get a handle. I mean, we've seen in the last month, as August ended, people were feeling that, a bit freer and that things were getting back to normal. Now infections have started to rise again and restrictions are coming back in. And so in the space of a month, it's kind of changed quite drastically. I think at the end of August, the job support scheme probably wasn't on the agenda, whereas by the end of September it was. And so, it's kind of such a fluid situation that it's very difficult to call, except to say that times are going to continue to be rough for a while.
Interesting, and we'll move on from unemployment a bit. Other than I think Amazon, the demand for crystal balls is going through the roof. I understand at the moment. Let's talk a little bit about the furlough scheme. So some interesting numbers here that initially I was confused by, I must admit, but now I've made sense of in terms of I guess the total number of furlough and the time series of furlough. Do you want to just explain this to folks in terms of how furlough has?
So the numbers are reported in two ways. One's a cumulative one, and the other one is a daily one. And the cumulative one has got to a higher point than the highest point of the daily one. So as you can see there, the daily one, which is the main chart, it got up to 8.9 million employees furloughed. Whereas the total has got up to 9.6 million. And that's simply because of phasing, basically, that there are some people that were furloughed not at the peak, but have been furloughed at other times, that the total gets up to that higher level, really. But as you can see there, the main thing today is that even by the end of July, nearly half of the peak level of furlough had fallen away. And you can see some real big changes there, like at the end of June, and then and before that, at the end of May. So it is quite lumpy, because if you think about it, at the end of each of those months, we had big changes. Because if you remember, the pubs opened on, I think it was July the 4th. And so those are the kind of the big shifts in sort of restrictions. And so, changes have been there across industries, and it's quite, good to see. But that 4.8 million in the middle of July is still, what, 15% of the workforce being paid to do nothing effectively.
And we've got a lag on this data as well, so we don't quite know up to the end of August how big that next jump was.
Absolutely, but I mean,
what's left to go?
Given the path, you'd expect it to at least still be in the millions somewhere by September.
Interesting. And then, I mean, we did a bit of analysis, didn't we, in terms of, well, if we look at that by industry and sector and say, well, what's changed over the course of June to July? Some interesting things to note here, weren't there?
Absolutely. I mean, in some ways, exactly what you would expect, in that sort of accommodation and food services is probably, got the furthest to go, partly because it's a big labour intensive industry, but also because those were if you think about the end of July, most of those businesses were still under very tight restrictions. Retail's a bit of an interesting one, because we have this big block of wholesale and retail, but only part of it has actually been badly affected. If you think about wholesale and supermarket retail, that's fine. That's if anything, they've been struggling to get enough toilet paper on the shelves. Whereas it's the high street retail, your clothes shops in city centres and so on that have really struggled most with the restrictions, and continue to do so.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to see, sort of manufacturing getting back to work more quickly. We'll get I'll pick Phil's brains as well a bit. So in the arts and sort of entertainment and the recreation part of the industry, which obviously he works in, that's been a slower return. So it'd be interesting to get some
absolutely
views.
I mean, the thing is, a lot of those jobs of course depend on physical presence, and so that they are the most affected. And one of the interesting things when you look at this industry level data is that lumpiness does carry across the piece pretty much. Slightly different stages for different industries, but that same monthly pattern of at the end of each month a big shift. So it's quite interesting, but it's worth saying that the scales on these are all different, because obviously if you plotted them on the same scale, an industry like energy production and supply, which is quite small in employment, would be really tiny compared to something like retail.
Yeah, no, interesting. We'll have a quick look at the self-employed scheme as well shortly, and interesting to note the construction sector there. We did a couple of things that I thought would be interesting, and there's a couple of slides here, just around first of all the regional variation. I guess the slide on or the visual on the right is really around the extent of furlough in terms of the total workforce. Do you want to look through that, and then I'll cover a couple of things on sort of the diversity angle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main thing to say is that no part of the country has been spared. Is the first thing. The second one is that places which have more of these kind of consumer-facing industries where physical presence is involved are more affected. Big cities with big commuter patterns, especially, and of course the main one here is London, and that's why London has that kind of the highest level of furlough going on. Really, it's kind of it's such a big travel area, and it's got all the tourism, including a lot of international tourism normally, and all those sort of shops and restaurants and all the different parts of London that have their economy dominated by those have really taken a terrible toll. Whereas in other parts of the country, they've still got all those industries, but they're more spread out, and they haven't got quite the concentrations there. So that's why London is up there. Probably Birmingham pushes West Midlands up a bit, but it can also just be the industry mix otherwise as well.
No, interesting. And just from a gender perspective, when I ran this chart, it looked like there was sort of a fairly normal or even mix of how furlough had been distributed. But actually, I read in the House Commons briefing paper this week, they quoted the IFS as talking about actually when they look at the occupations that women were in versus men, there was a significant higher probability that they would be furloughed, although the data doesn't play that out. So that's going to be an interesting one to watch when things flow through to unemployment, to see what the gender mix is of that.
Absolutely. I mean, there are always gender effects with economic disruptions. If you think back to the last recession with the financial crisis, there was a sort of a pattern where men bore the initial brunt, by which we mean jobs that are more taken by men. In terms of manufacturing sort of got hit and so on, construction, but then the aftermath sort of tended to affect women more, and so it was kind of a shorter, sharper shock to male dominated occupations, followed by a longer sustained hits to occupations which women tend to work in.
Yeah, no, makes sense. And there's a couple of other things again in that same paper, so if anyone wants to have a look at it, it's quite an interesting read. But there's a couple of insights here around furlough from an ethnicity point of view and also from an age point of view. So you can see that, you know, the loss of income we're now able to look at in terms of, you know, nationality, and really interesting looking at, again, the sort of the younger workforce, again thinking back to those unemployment figures, that, you know, nearly half of those workers that have been furloughed have been, you know, under the age of 35. So yeah, all useful indicators to monitor as things evolve. Just quickly, Duncan, on the self-employed scheme, I mentioned construction earlier. So again, £7.7 billion worth of cost versus the 37 on furlough. So this is chunky money, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's not exactly pocket change. Yeah, I mean, the self-employed scheme, as you can see there, construction is the kind of the big hit, but that reflects the structure of the industry. Most of all, my guess is, given what we know about construction generally, that will have phased down quite quickly since then. From my understanding is that the construction industry has sought to get back into operation, and of course they have the advantage of working in the open air a lot of the time as well, so that can help too. But yeah, so that's my understanding there. But yeah, the numbers involved are quite mind-boggling, it has to be said.
Yeah, and very similar in terms of, you know, your point about London earlier, you know, where the concentrations are obviously around working.
Of course, the two charts dovetail on that point, because of course London also has such a concentration of construction work in, especially around major projects and infrastructure. And so if construction was badly affected at that point, then London will tend to really be hit hard there.
I think we won't mention HS2 for very purposes. Brilliant. That's kind of the first half of kind of data sets. Let's get our panelists involved if we can. And Toni, if I can come to you in the first instance. So just to remind everyone, Toni works in the recruitment sector, and obviously the industry's been impacted significantly, as have your clients, by COVID. I mean, really been polarized, I guess, for those working in key workers and sort of sectors of the economy that have been frozen. But what have you seen the impact of furlough and unemployment have been? Where's the sector right now?
Yeah, I would say for furlough in particular, we kind of shared really Duncan's view in that it's frozen. An inevitable outcome that I think we're all kind of dreading and thinking can come yet. I mean, for recruitment, from a recruitment perspective, particularly temporary staffing specialists, the biggest challenge from furlough has been the interpretation of eligibility of the scheme, particularly for contingent workers. By their very nature, they tend to be used by our client businesses to flex up and down according to fluctuations in consumer patterns. So that's been quite a challenge, and there was certainly a time lag between the initial public announcement and the scheme detail actually reaching some of our businesses. But besides that, we kind of implemented measures really quickly. We saw our brands work incredibly fast to implement furlough payments to weekly payroll for temporary staff. But besides that, what we're kind of thinking is same really as most other businesses and sectors. We're bracing ourselves for the full impact once the scheme comes to a full close. So there's no telling just yet what the full impact will be. The disruption has clearly been significant across every sector, without exception.
So lots of pivoting going on in terms of thinking about, well, how do we change strategy? Really interesting, Toni. And Phill, sorry, Toni, no, carry on.
Oh, I was just going to say briefly, in terms of from an unemployment perspective, that some of the interesting things we've seen there has actually been around job seeker behaviour. We can already see that, you know, where we've kind of all sectors and industries have had a severe kind of candidate shortage, we've now seen that completely U-turn, obviously with the jobs shortage and an oversupply of candidates, and we've seen as much as kind of a 44% uplift in some instances of applicants through some of our specialist staff and brand websites, and we've even seen kind of as much as 11% of job searches being carried out with absolutely zero criteria, job role location criteria, which really reflects, I suppose, the desperation of some people to find any job anywhere.
Yeah, and there's been a huge amount of activity on, you know, various social media platforms of people, you know, recognizing people need help and how can we help people put their best foot forward, which is good to see, I guess, in the midst of a challenging time. Phill, can I come to you? Because I'm interested. I mean, obviously, from a sports industry perspective, you know, lots of freelancers, a really diverse economy. And you've had gyms closed. You've kind of seen, you know, lots of young workers in the industry as well. So what's happened in the sports sector from your perspective?
Yeah, I think you know, similar to many sectors, I think this hit like a massive sledgehammer. You know, it's been pretty destructive, but there are also some positives. You know, the three big, I suppose, risk elements, as you point out there, have been the self-employed element to our workforce. So our workforce, in terms of the professional workforce, is about 575,000. We do rely massively on the voluntary element too, particularly in the delivery of community sport, which is somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million. But in terms of the professional workforce, 22% of our workforce are self-employed. And the majority of that is the frontline workforce. And as you've already pointed out, you know, we're a service sector, and the large part of how we do what we do is by being in the same place at the same time with the people we deliver services to, and that's just not been an option. So back in March, you know, over 3/4 of the businesses in our sector were shut down. There was a big focus on trying to pivot. You know, I'm sure we all saw the success Joe Wicks had with delivering online sessions, and to some degree many of our more self-employed or practitioners were able to do a little bit of that, but not all. So the self-employed aspect has been a real challenge, and many, because of the average age as well, over 60% of our workforce are under the age of 34, which correlates with some of the data that you've been showing there. You know, we're generally low paid, and because of sort of all things culminating, many have struggled to access some of the financial packages, you know, perhaps because they've not got, you know, 2 years plus of financial records, etc., to get the self-employed support. So there's been some real challenges. However, there has also been a big coming together from the sector, you know, partly through the need for support, and that's something that we've been driving and working hard for. You know, on one hand, because I suppose since sort of July, August time, when to some degree we were in a position to start reopening, we worked incredibly hard with a number of other sector bodies and the government to, I suppose, provide clear and concise guidance on how they could do that safely and confidently as well. But whilst many of our businesses and practitioners are now starting to you know, resume some level of service, it is incredibly reduced capacity to what they have done previously, and still only certainly local authority facilities, only 75% of those are reopened. So there's still a significant chunk of facilities, leisure centres, which are just unable to open. So you know, come the end of October, when the furlough scheme ends, it's going to be quite a challenging time. And I think, similar to Toni, it's very difficult to have an accurate idea of exactly what that will look like beyond that point.
Yeah, no, really interesting, Phill. It's kind of the commercial feasibility and I guess folks falling through the cracks because the schemes were defined with particular rules. And then I mean, I kind of take a broader stance on this as well, of going, this is, you know, fundamental to the well-being of the nation, which is a hot topic that folks are talking about. And so how do we get the nation active? Because that's not just about money in the industry, but that's about, you know, the overall well-being of the country. Fascinating. Ali, can I come to you and just talk a little bit about, you know, with your kind of location and workplace being an important part of this whole lockdown and COVID experience. But so, I mean, what are you seeing and hearing in terms of the mindset of organisations and how they're going to be using office space in the future?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I mean, the impact on real estate and space, you know, as a whole has been seismic. And it's interesting when you look at it from the context of real estate. It's a multifaceted asset. So it's operational in one sense. So there's been a huge shift tactically, operationally, in terms of making office environments and workspaces COVID-proof. So, you know, one-way systems, shift patterns, hand sanitizers now a normality, but there was a big shift to get to that stage. So an awful lot of work has already been done to make spaces available. But what we're seeing longer term is that COVID has acted like a rocket ship in terms of accelerating conventional thinking. And it's not that it's necessarily anything new, but that, you know, 2-3 years worth of planning has been now accelerated into a few short months. So businesses are being forced to look at how they operate space, how they take space, how they use space, from kind of traditional metrics of looking at one-to-one desk ratios in commercial aspects, looking at Monday to Friday coming into the office versus remote working, and looking at 9 to 5 hours versus flexible hours. Again, it's nothing new, but businesses have had to be forced to really consider that en masse, and the impact then in terms of space is massive. So businesses are trying to now embed flexibility where they can in how they take space, having to be super flexible as well, and looking at location. So location broadly speaking as well, looking at rather than, you know, where can I place my asset in relation to the city, businesses are now having to be quite future focusing on how can we actually repurpose a portfolio to be better connected to our workforce. So that dynamic has totally changed. So yeah, the impact has been massive, both immediate and longer term. So I mean, quite rightly, the focus has been on employee health and well-being, and you know, that's absolutely necessary. But longer term, there's a really exciting challenge in how businesses need to look at space and build them as less kind of big rooms full of desks and monitors, but centers for innovation and collaboration.
Yeah, really. I mean, really interesting. I mean, as you know, I'm an HR guy by trade, and the thought that the speed of change that could be driven in terms of how organisations are planning their cultures and what do they want their business to be. I mean, it's just unprecedented that this could happen so quickly. I guess the question is how long will it stick? Do you get a sense of, has it reached a stage now where this is actually change forever, or do you think companies will go back to, oh well, now COVID's sorted, whenever that may be, we'll go back to the old way?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out from sector to sector. Because if you look at the tech sector, they've been, broadly speaking, very happy with working from home. Financial services, Big Four consultancy, that kind of these kind of professional areas have been somewhat reluctant, but are now coming back into the office as well. So what will be really interesting to see is, from a cultural angle, whether businesses will be able to compete by coming back and offering the same setup pre-COVID as a more agile and flexible approach post-COVID. Because buildings and offices have a real pull factor on a business, no doubt, but I don't think that you can just go straight back to how it was, depending on the work environment and the function, but going straight back to a pre-COVID setup in what will be a very new normal could be quite an uncompetitive strategy from a talent attraction retention perspective.
Yeah, fascinating, interesting times for certain. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move us on kind of to the second half of the discussion, and we're going to talk through a little bit about what's going on from a hiring activity point of view. I mean, briefly, I'll bring Duncan back in, but this is what we government data on what's called the Job Vacancies report that kind of shows us some interesting trends and a nice little arrow there, Duncan, in terms of what we've seen over the last few months.
The arrow of hope, you might call it. Yeah, it's. I mean, effectively, large parts of the economy just slammed on the brakes once things started to get moving in March and April. And we saw that, as I think we'll come on to in our own job postings data, but I think the ONS vacancy data, which is survey based, backs it up entirely, that if you're in an affected industry, then the first and easiest thing to do is stop recruiting new people, and that kind of frozenness in the labour market sort of really applied there. But since the summer, we have started to see it coming back, but it's kind of quite tentative and cautious, and we're still a long way from the sort of the levels of recruitment activity that we saw at the start of the year, which was, it should be said, an extremely tight labour market.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and scary. I mean, for context, folks can look back at this data, but lowest level since 2001, since these records were started. So certainly, if we compare this to the financial crisis, a much bigger impact. And to Tony's point as well, I was just going to say it's interesting in terms of applicant volumes, and if you look at the ratio of unemployed to vacancies, that probably is only set to continue as things flow through the economy. In terms of hiring activity, and so we kind of, if we look at where those vacancies are, it's kind of, yes, all well and good, vacancies on the rise, but it's where are they? So there's some interesting views here, human health dominating the charts, Duncan.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of the conditions we're in mean that's a boom time industry now, and probably will be for some time ahead. Even were there a vaccine next year, that it alone creates its own demands anyway. But I think there's a heightened awareness about health service capacity over this year that will probably stay for some years to come, and sort of a caution about not having enough health service capacity in place. So I think that holds up well. But the interesting side is, you see some of the other areas, the professional, scientific and technical, for example, which is kind of a lot of that work can be done from home. And so that's held up quite well. Retail is a bit deceptive because it's labour intensive anyway. So in raw numbers, it's quite easy for retail to generate a lot. And if you look at the size of the coloured segment within that, you can see that they're getting a lot thinner as time has gone on. The green bar is a lot bigger than the red bar. Whereas, if you look at something like professional, scientific and technical, it's a bit more even. So yeah, it's health, as you say, is boom time.
Yeah, and retail obviously probably skewed slightly by the growth of e-retail, depending on quite how that insight.
And supermarket retail is very robust because people still need their groceries, but it's the high street segment that is kind of suffered.
Yeah. And we kind of, you did a nice little sort of trend analysis here of by sector. Again, the scales are slightly different, are they? But it shows kind of a similar story, other than in public admin and defence, which looks like it was booming.
Yes. Well, okay. I mean, remember that the timescales on these go back some years. So you can see that sort of public admin and defence have been rising in demand. That's kind of changed over time. These are the ONS data, aren't they? Yes, exactly. So and so that's been rising. Well, of course, the thing is with that data on the public admin and defence, if you think to the first half of the 2010s, we were in the height of the austerity period. So public admin and defence, to some extent, has kind of been recovering through the early part of this period. But yeah, I mean, what you can see is a sort of a consistent trend across all industries in the last few months. Even human health and social work, it should be said, has still been dented. It's still quite a jolt to it, Whereas, you know, you look at something like, I mean, construction's interesting because of the bounce back, that it really plummeted. Construction is very sensitive to economic conditions. We always find this in every recession, but you can also see how it's really rebounded. You know, so from going down about 80-odd%, it's kind of recovered, you know, almost half of that drop now. So yeah, quite interesting.
Sharp spikes. And for our audience, if anyone's interested, this is actually an interactive chart that we have on our website. So if you want to access that and look at particular sectors, you can do that. We've looked at our job postings data as well, and I ran these insights, and actually what I did slightly different to normal was I looked at the highest volume of people posting. So obviously we're picking out largely the key worker sectors and the areas where the economy's bouncing back strongest. And I've actually compared it on this chart to their actual career sites of these companies. So how do job postings relate to vacancies? For those that aren't familiar with job postings, that's a measure essentially of recruitment marketing activity. Now, I mean, the NHS is fascinating and blows the charts essentially, unless you change the scales, because you've got kind of 40,000 postings out there and 17,000 postings on the website. But some interesting trends here, again, that support you know, the different sectors that are most active. Duncan, anything you'd sort of comment on this that you think?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the health and Amazon all hold up well, and of course you'd expect them to. Whereas, yeah, I mean, Next Retail is a classic high street retailer. It's been affected badly. McDonald's is interesting because, of course, they've been managing to sort of get their businesses operating as well, and so it's quite an interesting mix. The supermarkets remain pretty solid except for Aldi, but the thing is, when you look at individual companies, this can start to get quite sort of dependent on when they're doing recruiting and things like that. So yeah, but it's interesting, the sort of the range of experiences, certainly.
Yeah, and I think, and for anyone that's interested, you know, this is obviously the high end of the market and the high volume. Actually, some of the work we do with the Recruitment Employment Confederation for folks that are interested, you know, so what's really interesting is looking at what's changing on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, and perhaps in the lower volume categories, what skills are actually emerging as being in demand, what parts of the country are seem to be responding and more activity happening. So there's data available on that if people are interested in specific locations, and we'll share our contact details should that be interesting to you. We'll move on just to the last section, and one of the things I wanted us to talk about was kind of changing workforce patterns, and obviously, you know, some of our panelists have talked about that already, but there's a whole bunch of surveys. I picked one from the CIPD because I used to work for CIPD, so and Peter Cheese talking about yeah, kind of the step change that we're likely to see to remote working. I think that was from employers rather than individuals. I've seen other data that looks at, you know, nearer 80 to 90% of individuals saying, hey, we like this, you know, can we have more of it? And we've actually been seeing that in some of our data around sort of the rise in demand of jobs that are suggesting that they're based work location is flexible. Duncan, I mean, that's quite a marked rise, isn't it, in terms of, you know, in that time frame?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing you have to remember about this data is that it's the tip of the iceberg, because it's from job postings, and all we can do is tag those job postings that specifically say remote working is available. And of course, many jobs, I mean, I remote work, but my job wasn't advertised as being remote working. So you can sort of see how it's an under report in that sense, but you would expect that level of reporting to be sort of fairly stable over time, and to sort of see a near tripling in the space of 6 months of the level of people saying that the job can be done remotely is quite a stark, dramatic change, although of course we're used to those at the moment.
Well, it's going to be, you know, I guess similar to Ali's point earlier, and I guess again, one example, there's lots of research from the real estate world around people thinking about changing work location and actually going, I don't want to live in a city anymore, and really rethinking where they want to be based because of that shift to work.
Absolutely. I mean, the flip side, and Ali alluded to this, is that you're able to move lots of people to work remotely in the short term a lot easier than the long term, because lots of relationships already exist. And so being able to kind of assume that that will carry on for years into the future is a wholly different question, really.
There's a whole new data set coming there, I'm sure, in due course. And we see, and I know Toni and I talked about this before before the webinar, but interesting that we're seeing an increase in rise for temp labour. Impellam perhaps less so. I'll let her comment on that shortly, but certainly we're seeing, I guess, organisations potentially hedging their bets and thinking, if I'm going to hire, I might, look to borrow or hire temporarily before I bring someone on permanently until we know a little bit more about the future. But I think that will be very variable by sector.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. And again, this is what people talk about as well in their job postings. You kind of have to think that there may sometimes be situations where these discussions go on after the job is advertised as well sometimes.
Yeah, interesting. There's one last slide, and I'm conscious of time, but just what I wanted to share this just with the audience so that they're aware of it, because obviously with all of the things happening domestically, actually the topic of migration has pretty much gone off the agenda, it seems. But actually there was a white paper shared a couple of days ago, which has gone to the Home Secretary from the Migration Advisory Committee. Now this looks at, for those of you that aren't aware, the shortage occupation list, and with a number of key recommendations around the types of occupation that are being requested to be added to the list, even though we're not sure what the change to talent supply is going to be with the impact of sort of furlough and unemployment levels. So some interesting insights here, particularly around, I guess, some occupations I wouldn't have expected to see. So it'd be really interesting to dig into this a little bit more, and also a recommendation that the approach taken is devolved across the different nations of the UK. And a couple of specific points that were made by the chairman of the Migration Advisory Committee as well. Looking at wages in social care, which I think many of us can empathise with, and go, how do we make sure that we're attracting people to that industry? And also a look at there is some new data that's going to be released to the MAC around the progression of migrants in the labour market. So what happens when they're working here? Are they able to progress through their careers? So it's a very big report, 659 pages, if I recall correctly, but worth a read.
That's your weekend.
Your weekend read, definitely. I might take a week. Let's get back to our panelists if we can, and just to kind of get some more perspective. So I'm going to kind of go to Ali first, and a generic question really to all of you in terms of, what changes are you kind of seeing in your organisation beyond those we've already talked about? I mean, is the market reigniting, I guess, in your sectors? And what changes in organisational strategy are you seeing? Ali, anything that you'd sort of like to build on that?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Three big things really in terms of org strategy and behaviour. The first is around data-led decision making. Because there's so much at stake here, decisions have to be totally robust, and it's forcing businesses to get really under the skin of problems, understand their scenarios, and be able to come up with proper, robust solutions. So that whole frame of thinking, while be it nothing exceptionally new, that depth of understanding and data-led decision making is something that's coming far more to the fore, and we foresee as sticking as well. Not just in terms of the real estate data around kind of cost and utility and flexibility, but also around well-being. So, as real estate organisations and as our clients, as heads of real estate, are very, very aware that we've had people move from controlled purpose-built working environments to working from home, working remotely, from anything from and it kind of, it's very revealing who you're speaking to as to whether they're actually working in an office at home or whether they're having to endure sitting on the floor with a laptop on the lap. But collecting data around employee well-being is going to be crucial to long-term business performance, because it's just not going to work having people in uncomfortable positions and in uncomfortable working environments. So that's a key area of focus for us and for our clients, is how, even with mass mobile working or remote working, how we can provide working environments that are conducive to the tasks that people are being asked to perform. The second is around flexibility, and how businesses can embed flexibility in what is traditionally a very fixed asset class. So how can we look at lease structures? How can we look at occupation metrics? And also kind of reinventing how we actually look at space. Can we look at sharing space? Flex offices is nothing new, but it's going to be a core part of any future decision making in terms of real estate strategy. And the last one then is around location strategy. So it's really kind of throwing a grenade under conventional thinking. And when you look at the demographics or the skills mapping or the skills availability of a catchment area, those catchment areas are now doubled or tripled. So how do you look at your physical location when you're making an investment decision? It is going to be a really interesting process of decision making over the next, immediate and longer term, I'd imagine.
Yeah, really, it's really changed the game, hasn't it? Kind of, again, with my age, the war for talent. Well, actually, talent pools just got a lot bigger. If people are thinking creatively. And Toni, it leads nicely into the recruitment sector, doesn't it? What about your views?
I've got so many. I've got so many based on what you've shown. Actually, I think all of it's extremely thought-provoking. And if I think of Impellam and its different recruitment brands, it covers every sector. So there really is quite a mixed bag, and the story is totally different depending on what sector you're talking about or the prospects. So if I was to take as an example, some of the key changes that we've seen, or immediate changes we've seen, have been, probably as an example where Duncan was saying the public service or public admin investment peak. While that's a latent view, I think we can probably imagine that we're going to see similar again, and that's reflective of the investment of the government in lots of different services, public services, to complement perhaps physical COVID support services. So as an example, we've seen kind of a huge demand for call centre operatives, and that has been to support stand up of 7 different public service phone lines through one of our clients. We've seen a migration of workers kind of that would historically or typically have been in hospitality and catering with DBS clearance, where there was huge demand for universities and schools, actually migrate and stay now in the healthcare sector in new roles for hospital catering.
Wow.
And obviously transfer their DBS clearances with them. We've seen very little recovery in the perm jobs market, but again, it depends which sector you're looking at. As you rightly say, scientific sector has had better resilience there. Hospitality and catering, it benefited a bit from the Eat Out, Help Out scheme, but that has been, I think, a very short-term win. And actually, it's hard to differentiate what has been a result of the that scheme and what has been a result of the actual lockdown restrictions lifting at the end of July. But certainly in September, it's faltering again. What we were seeing as a bit of a recovery is definitely faltering. If I look at things like, so you're seeing, you kind of had a slide where you were showing a bit of a rise in terms of temporary staffing. Some of that could be seasonal. We're certainly expecting a modest peak season that we would normally see in the warehouse logistics, all complementing kind of the retail build up for Christmas. So the more kind of robust, I would say, changes that we've seen have been where there is greater government investment in particularly the engineering sector and construction of, say, our fibre network needs as a country. From a change in organisational strategy perspective, very much with Ali on that in terms of data and decision making becoming so much more important, and how we're seeing that being used is actually a higher strategic approach to workforce planning. To tackle lots of things, employee well-being being one of them, but certainly the different change and mix in skills that are now required for a mostly remote working workforce in many of our sectors. So, an example would be that we're seeing suddenly where, as before, I don't know, attention to detail may have been important, actually words like resilience or compassion or negotiation are suddenly ranking much higher in terms of the most in-demand skills. So I think there's a whole range of different things that we're noticing and seeing that cover workforce development, skill succession planning, and then overall data and decision making in terms of trying to project and forecast what workforce mix is going to be most suited to business recovery. And as I say, it's a real mixed bag depending on which sector you're looking at, but that's generally what we're seeing.
Really fascinating. There's going to be a book written at some point on, how the world changed, or the world of work changed. Phill, just coming to you for thoughts from your perspective, and we are overrunning a bit, but I'm cool with that. So let's just keep going.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly seeing some recovery, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. So, as I mentioned previously, and we are technically reopened, but we've not been able to all reopen. And of the research and insight that we've done, around 70% of businesses are saying that the income that they've been able to generate post reopening is either not sustainable or only sustainable for a short time. So this, in this kind of uncertain time where we're not quite sure what's going to happen next, we're keeping a really close eye on that. And it was picked up on the BBC yesterday that we're anticipating that without a bit of government support, or a significant bit of government support, we're at risk of losing 250 to 300,000 jobs within the sector, which is obviously an incredible concern. However, as I said, that we are seeing some positive signs as well, and certainly the way in which many individuals and organisations were able to adapt during lockdown has helped them come out of it a little bit stronger and a bit more versatile as well, going at it with more of a blended approach that includes some online delivery and support services, as well as the face-to-face element. And now that we're in a position to actually see participants and clients and members again, we've certainly taken very serious steps and to be COVID secure, which is something that we've had a real key part in helping the workforce achieve. I think looking forwards, and picking on one of the comments you mentioned earlier, Matt, is that obviously this is very much about the health and well-being of the nation. So what we're hoping is that we can broaden the marketplace and, by demonstrating our impact as an effective workforce to support people with both long and short-term medical conditions. This happens already to some extent, but not consistently across the UK. So we're pushing hard with, as you mentioned, the professional standards that we've got and partnerships to get that recognition, to perhaps take some of the burden off the NHS and actually mobilise sport and physical activity workforce into a newer space, in a usable and useful space for the country.
Which would be amazing. And I guess, I'll be interested, kind of as we're wrapping up, Phill, the job support scheme. And I think, I was certainly expecting to see a more industry or sector focused scheme than the one that was announced this week. And the point you make about the risk of potential job losses in the sports industry brings that to home if businesses aren't viable commercially because of various restrictions. What's Cimspa's or the industry's reaction been to that? And I guess there's quite a lot of lobbying going on still.
Yeah, a huge amount of lobbying. So we've been working with Sport England, who is our skills council. They've provided a significant amount of financial support to help, I suppose, remobilise the workforce, including support directly to create a COVID secure workforce and the training behind that, as well as a retraining package to help companies prepare better for future needs and I suppose pivot. But we are currently pushing really hard with the government and with the DCMS to try and get more financial support, because it's just clear that at some point, unless something changes, there's going to be a bit of a fall off a cliff for many organisations in the sector, and with that, many jobs will go with it. Through the calculations we've looked at, with the closing of a single leisure centre, on average, that's going to take with it anywhere between 40 and 100 jobs. So you can sort of, once you start to multiply that, you can see a real challenge and gap.
Yeah, and holes in local communities, and as you say, the potential to ease the burden on the NHS for the industry is an enormous one. So I'm sure many of our audience will encourage and support that, and maybe we need to create a campaign to support that. If you need our help, you know where we are. But thanks for sharing those views. I mean, Toni, and from your perspective, kind of reflections and thinking about the future, and add any thoughts you've got on the job support scheme, if you'd like to share any. What are your views?
Yeah, I mean, there's not enough details, I wouldn't say just yet, for us to work out how to be of the best value in terms of the job support scheme. There's lots of different avenues of interest there, definitely, and clearly with the billions of pounds of investment that there is to either create jobs or support existing jobs, I think that would, it's naturally going to be a place where some of our recruitment brands will want to be, and be holding the hands of our clients to make the most of those schemes, and kind of work out how it actually translates into practice and action. And also, I'm kind of conscious that perhaps for some of our education brands, there's definitely a move towards working out how the £1 billion of funding in terms of the catch-up premium, how that's going to translate in terms of genuine support for young people and children, children's education that has perhaps suffered during the early stages of the lockdown, and we're still trying to work out how that's going to transpire, particularly with kind of these localized lockdowns that you're seeing, where a whole year in a secondary school can suddenly be placed in quarantine or lockdown. There's definitely a change again in skills and demand that we might find actually changes certain elements of how teaching is delivered, gravitating towards a more online method, but again, there's complexities in that, because there's a lot of assumptions around what technology setup is available at home. You don't want to disadvantage any further already underprivileged households. So yeah, it's a very complex view, and I think there is no one answer yet. We're also trying to find our feet as to work out what some of those government schemes really mean on the ground, and how we can work alongside businesses to help them.
Yeah, interesting. It's like a very big complex jigsaw, isn't it? That everyone is trying to go, right, what do we do first and where do we start? I mean,
and more details needed, really, I think, from the government on some of these, because it's wonderful that there is that investment, but it's trying to work out, so what does that actually mean and where, in a way that you can then kind of start advising businesses, and employers, to say, okay, this is how this could translate to your world, and how you can do your bit, really.
Yeah, and I know from conversations yesterday with some of our education partners, I know many on the call, but similar sort of craving extra detail around the skills agenda as well. Thanks, Toni. That's amazing. I mean, Ali, any last reflections from you?
I mean, plans for 2021. We're planning on getting married, so we're going to have to see what happens in terms of the government guidelines on that. But from a business side, I think the challenge is urban mobility and transport around cities. There's a huge area of focus that needs to be embedded there. Cash flow protection for our clients, and also instilling a more sustainable and wellness-minded work-life balance. That's kind of been touched on quite a bit in this conversation, but redressing that grey area of work and personal space, so that people do get enough time to focus on having time outside of work. In terms of opportunities, reshaping portfolios and building in more resilience. And geographically, looking at the regions, I think there's a huge opportunity for rebalancing there in terms of employment, talent, and investment. And lastly, greater empowerment for employees to be able to work in a manner that best works for them. I think that's going to be a long-term shift and one that can be really positive.
No, brilliant. Some really great conversation, I think, and ideas and thoughts, and yeah, interesting opportunities for collaboration across different sectors and different parts of the economy, which hopefully will fall out of this. I'm conscious of time, so I think for audience questions, Debbie, what we'll do is we'll read those questions that have been raised and we'll get back to folks, if that's okay, because conscious people's diaries are probably overrunning significantly now. Before I kind of sum up and sort of close things off, Duncan, any final thoughts from you? Because you're the brains behind the outfit, as I said at the start, and you didn't disappoint.
Yeah, I think just to follow on that job support scheme discussion there, I mean, this is an interesting experiment because we're going from furlough, which is kind of the blunderbuss approach of just fire everything you've got, to an attempted much more targeted approach, which will hopefully cost less money, but will be more bureaucratic. And this is kind of the classic policy dilemma that, no targeting means lots of dead weight, but more targeting means lots of bureaucracy. It might not get where you want it to do. It might have perverse incentives. And so, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see sort of how effective that is. But, there is a tension anyway, because I think part of the reason why the government wants to end furlough is not only this question about sort of the cost, but is a wider one about adaptation. What we don't know is how long we're going to have to live with the coronavirus. We hope for a vaccine next year, but maybe that happens, maybe it doesn't, maybe it works as advertised, maybe it doesn't. And so I think that there must be some feeling within Treasury that you have to prepare for the possibility that we just have to adapt to a changed world, besides all the changes that are going to persist anyway, as we've been talking about remote working, for example. And so just keeping people in jobs that may not actually have a future is not ideal from that adaptation point of view, but equally sort of ripping off the plaster too quickly might be too painful as well. And so it's a real kind of a difficult line to tread, really, and it'll be interesting to see how well the job support scheme helps to do that, really.
Yeah, scenario planning nightmare, really, because normally people can at least go, well, we've got a rough idea what's going to happen. The truth is, people really don't right now.
No, absolutely.
But just, I'm going to wrap things up. Just a couple of quick sort of closing notes from us. One is obviously loads of webinars that we're running. Hopefully you found this enjoyable. There's a number on our website with the URL there if you want to join future events. Of course, we'd love, we have many customers on the call, so thanks to all the panelists who are customers of ours who have joined, but we'd welcome conversations with other businesses. If you need help on labour market data, please do get in touch. A quick plug on something we're really excited about. I'm not going to read this slide out. I'm just going to point you to the URL. Emsi Skills is a really innovative idea in the world of skills, very relevant in today's marketplace. So if anyone's interested to understand what Emsi Skills are, please get in touch with the team. And last of all, I guess just thanks to our panelists, Phill, Toni, Ali, really great contributions, and I think really high value to share what's going on the ground in different sectors. Debbie, thank you for your organisation skills. Debbie's our marketing and events manager, as you know, at the beginning, and Duncan for your brains as always. And thanks last of all to the audience. So I hope you've enjoyed the session, and we'll call that a wrap. Wishing you all a great rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, Matt. Cheers, Debbie.